Steve Harvey wasn't the kind of man you could easily catch off guard. Years in comedy, years in television, years in rooms full of people waiting for him to stumble, and watching him turn mistakes into laughter. But that night, the cameras would catch something no joke could save. The studio lights burned hot over his head. The audience buzzed. The monitor in front of him showed the segment title in bold white letters. Faith and Fame. Jonathan Roumie live. Steve adjusted his tie, flashing that famous mustache grin. On paper, this was just another interview. Another celebrity guest. But the man waiting backstage wasn't like the others. Jonathan Roumie, best known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, stepped into the light. The crowd erupted before Steve could even open his mouth. The kind of applause that feels more like reverence than noise. They shook hands. Jonathan's grip was warm, steady. Steve caught himself looking at the man's eyes just a second too long. There was something in them. Something that made him forget the teleprompter was already scrolling. Jonathan Roumie, everybody, Steve said, the words almost automatic. Then, silence. The laughter lines around his eyes softened. And instead of the usual first question, about career, about fame, about projects, Steve heard himself say, "Man, you really play Jesus. But who is Jesus to you?" Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't fidget. He just leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees like the two of them were sitting in some back porch conversation nobody else could hear. "You really want to know?" he asked. "Yeah," Steve said, and this time it wasn't a host asking, it was a man asking. Jonathan took a deep breath. And then, he started to speak. "It's not just a role. It's not just lines. To me, Jesus is the man who sat at the table with people no one else would touch. Who walked straight into storms he could have avoided. Who saw people, not for what they'd done, but for what they could still become." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Steve nodded slowly. I get that," he murmured. But Jonathan wasn't finished. "And he's not some distant figure in a book," Jonathan said. "He's here, now, in the way you choose to forgive someone before they even say sorry. In the way you treat the man on the street like he's already worth your time. He's in those moments when the cameras aren't on, and nobody's clapping, and you still decide to love anyway." Something shifted in Steve's posture. It was subtle, but real. The man who could roll through any interview with a joke now had his lips pressed together, eyes blinking slower. In the control room, the producer's voice cracked through Steve's earpiece. Steve, we're live. We've got ad breaks to hit. Wrap it." But Steve didn't even reach for the cue cards. He was staring at Jonathan like the rest of the world had gone blurry. "You know," Steve finally said, voice lower than before, "I've been doing this a long time. Met everybody. But you just made me forget we're on TV right now." Jonathan smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was quiet, like he knew that somewhere, beyond the lights, beyond the cameras, someone needed to hear exactly what had just been said. The audience leaned in, sensing it too. Every laugh track, every clapping cue, every bit of show business polish, gone. It was just two men, and a name that still carried weight. And that was the moment, before the commercials, before the headlines, when something in the air changed. Because Steve Harvey wasn't just hearing an actor talk about a role. He was hearing a man talk about a friend. And for a split second, he forgot the lights, he forgot the clock, he forgot the world watching. The applause sign blinked on above. The audience. But no one was clapping. They were still locked in the silence Jonathan had left hanging in the air. Even the stagehands, people who had seen every celebrity under the sun, were standing a little straighter, eyes fixed forward. Steve shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on his cue cards. The producers in the control room were panicking. "You've got to move on, Steve," one voice hissed through his earpiece. But the words barely registered. "Tell me something," Steve said, leaning closer. "That thing you just said, about forgiving people before they even say sorry, you ever had to do that?" "For real?" Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. "Yes." One word. Solid. Heavy. Steve tilted his head. "Who?" Jonathan's voice softened. "Someone I loved, and trusted." They walked away without an explanation. Years later, they reached out. "I realized I'd already forgiven them. Not because they earned it, but because I had to be free." The audience murmured. It wasn't gossip fuel. It was the kind of story you feel in your chest. Steve sat back, letting out a low whistle. "See, I don't know if I could do that," he admitted. "I hold on to stuff. I say I let it go, but truth is, it sits in the back of my mind. And sometimes it comes back like it just happened yesterday. Jonathan nodded. That's the thing. Forgiveness isn't a favor you do for someone else. It's setting yourself free from the chains you didn't even know you were dragging. Steve glanced at the audience, then back to Jonathan. You preaching now, man? Jonathan chuckled, but it was warm, not mocking. I'm just telling you what I've lived. The control room interrupted again, more frantic this time. Steve, move to the next segment. Sponsors are watching, but Steve ignored it. His eyes narrowed, curious. All right, you play Jesus. You say you live this stuff. But what about when the world makes you angry? When they disrespect you, you still stay calm. Jonathan's jaw tightened just slightly. I've lost my temper before. I've said things I regret. But the difference is, I know who I represent now. It's not about winning arguments. It's about winning people. Steve let that sink in. Winning people, he repeated quietly. Jonathan leaned in. You can be right, and still lose the person. Jesus never traded people for points. The audience fell into another hush. Someone in the back sniffled. Steve cleared his throat. You know, you're messing me up right now, he said, half smiling. I had my questions lined up. You just threw the whole playbook out. Jonathan gave a small nod. Maybe the questions aren't the point. Steve laughed, short, almost nervous. You know what? You're right, but I've got producers waving at me like the building's on fire. Jonathan glanced toward the control room. They'll survive. This is more important. That single sentence. Steve felt it. The audience felt it. And somewhere in the building, a sponsor probably clenched their jaw. For the first time in his career, Steve Harvey felt a strange mix of defiance and peace settle over him. The kind you get when you realize you might be risking your job, but you're doing it for the right reason. So, Steve said slowly, if you could tell everybody watching right now, millions of people, one thing about Jesus, what would it be? Jonathan took his time answering. I'd say, stop picturing him as a man who's too holy to understand you. Start seeing him as the man who's walked through every pain you've ever felt, and didn't leave. Steve stared at him, almost forgetting to breathe. That's a word right there, he whispered. The audience was still. The cameras kept rolling. The producer's voice in Steve's ear had gone silent, either from frustration, or because they realized nothing was going to pull him away from this moment. And that was when Steve understood something. He wasn't just conducting an interview anymore. He was sitting in the middle of a conversation that was bigger than ratings, bigger than celebrity, bigger than the show itself. It was risky, it was raw, and if he kept going, it could change the entire tone of the night. But something in Jonathan's presence told him. Maybe that was the point. Steve Harvey leaned forward. The bright studio lights caught the edges of his suit, but he barely noticed. The world outside the stage, the sponsors, the time cues, the polished comedy bits, faded. All that remained was Jonathan, sitting across from him, looking steady. Almost unshakable. All right, Steve said, voice low but with that gravelly emphasis he used when the truth was coming. You've been saying all this about grace and love and forgiveness. But what about the people who don't want to hear it? Who laugh in your face? What then? Jonathan didn't flinch. I still love them. Steve blinked. That easy? Jonathan leaned in. No, it's not easy. But love isn't a reaction. It's a choice. The words landed like a soft hammer. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. A man in the front row shifted in his seat. Someone else coughed, just to break the tension. You know, Steve said, I grew up with church all around me. My mama made sure I knew the Bible. But somewhere along the way, I got tired of all the talk. Too many people saying, love your neighbor, and then turning their back when you needed them most. Jonathan nodded slowly. That's why I don't just talk about Jesus. I try to live him. There was a pause. Steve could hear the faint static in his earpiece, the sound of producers holding back. No one dared cut him off now. You think the world really wants Jesus? Steve asked. Jonathan's eyes glinted under the lights. I think the world wants the real Jesus. The one who sat with the outcasts. The one who didn't flinch at people's mess. The one who could look you in the eye and tell you the truth, without stripping you of your dignity. That's when it happened. Steve forgot about the cameras. Forgot about the millions watching. Forgot this was live television. Man, he said, leaning back and shaking his head, you're making me think about stuff I've been trying to forget for years. Jonathan tilted his head. Like what? Steve exhaled, long and slow. I had a friend. We fell out, bad. Over money, over pride, over words we can't take back. I've been holding that in my chest for so long, I forgot what it felt like to breathe without it. The room was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the cameras. Jonathan spoke gently. You could call him. Steve laughed, but it was hollow. Yeah, and what if he hangs up? Jonathan's tone didn't change. Then you'll know you tried. And you'll walk lighter. Because it won't be about what he does, it'll be about you being free. The audience murmured softly. Someone clapped once, then stopped, realizing it wasn't that kind of moment. You're telling me to forgive on national television, Steve said, half smiling. I'm telling you to live free, Jonathan replied. Steve sat there for a long moment. The cue cards in his hands were useless now. You know, he said finally, I had a segment planned. Funny story. Some rapid-fire questions. But, forget it. Let's go where this is going. The crowd stirred. This wasn't the Steve Harvey they expected. This was stripped down, no jokes, no fluff, just a man wrestling with truth in front of everyone. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Steve, what's stopping you? Steve opened his mouth, closed it again. He felt his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. I guess, he stopped. Looked down. I guess I don't want to look weak. Jonathan's voice was steady. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you'll ever do. It means you've decided not to let the wound tell your story anymore. Steve swallowed hard. That's a good line. It's not a line, Jonathan said. It's my life. And right there, something shifted in Steve's eyes. The way he sat, the way he looked at Jonathan. Like a man realizing he'd been holding the wrong weight for a long time. The audience didn't clap. They didn't shout. They just listened. Because in that moment, everyone in the room knew, this wasn't a TV segment anymore. This was a live, unedited confession. A conversation you couldn't script. And Steve Harvey, for the first time in his career, wasn't performing the resolution and emotional after. Steve sat there, still holding the cue cards like they might rescue him from the rawness of the moment. But no rescue came, and maybe, that was the point. Jonathan didn't press. He just let the silence breathe. And in that stillness, Steve's voice cracked, just enough to tell the truth was coming. You know what's crazy? Steve said. All my life, I thought if I kept the laughs coming, the pain wouldn't catch up. I thought if I stayed busy enough, I could outrun it. But you, he shook his head slowly, you just sat here and made it plain. Jonathan's mouth curved into a small, understanding smile. It's not me, Steve. It's the truth. And the truth doesn't need a stage. It just needs a heart that's willing to listen. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not the restless kind, but the kind that comes when people realize they're in the middle of something real. Steve leaned back, looking up at the studio lights like they were stars. I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm gonna call him. Tonight. The audience didn't erupt. They didn't cheer like in some scripted finale. They just held the space with him. It was sacred in its own quiet way. Jonathan nodded, as if to seal the promise. You'll never regret choosing peace. The producer's voice broke through Steve's earpiece, hesitant. Steve, we're still live. For a split second, Steve almost laughed. Yeah, he said out loud, I know we're live. And for once, I'm glad. Because maybe someone out there is holding on to something they need to let go of too. Jonathan's gaze swept the room. That's the thing about forgiveness, it's contagious. You set one person free, and suddenly, the chains start breaking all over the place. A man in the third row wiped his eyes. A woman squeezed the hand of the stranger next to her. Steve turned back to Jonathan. You ever think about how weird it is, talking about Jesus on TV like this? Jonathan shrugged lightly. I don't think about where I'm talking. I think about who might be listening. And that line, it landed so deep that Steve didn't even try to follow it with humor. He just sat there, nodding. The stage manager signaled from the wings, 2 minutes left. Steve ignored it. You know what? I want to end this show different, he said. No music, no credits rolling over a joke. Just you, saying what you came here to say. Jonathan took a deep breath. And then, without theatrics, he spoke. Jesus isn't an idea. He's not a slogan. He's a person who loves you right where you are, but loves you too much to leave you there. You're not too far gone. You're not too broken. And if you think you've ruined everything, you haven't. Because he can take what you meant for failure and turn it into something beautiful. All you have to do is say yes. Silence. Not a pin drop silence, deeper than that. The kind that feels like the whole room is holding its breath. Steve stared at him for a moment, his usual quick wit nowhere to be Found. Then he whispered, almost to himself, man, I needed that. The red light above the main camera went dark. The show was over. But nobody moved. Not the audience. Not the crew. Not Steve. It was Jonathan who finally stood, offering Steve his hand. Steve took it, holding on a moment longer than necessary. You just changed my day, man. Jonathan smiled. Maybe it's the start of changing more than that. Later that night, in a quiet dressing room, Steve sat alone with his phone in his hand. The name on the screen was one he hadn't dialed in years. His thumb hovered over the call button. He thought about the cameras, the audience, Jonathan's words. And for the first time in a long time, he pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. Then a voice, familiar, older, but still the same, answered. Steve. Steve's throat tightened. Yeah, it's me. Listen, I don't know how to say this, but I'm sorry. There was a pause on the other end. Then, softly, I've been waiting to hear that for a long time. Steve closed his eyes. And in that moment, it was like the weight he'd been carrying slid right off his shoulders. Somewhere in another part of the city, Jonathan Roumie was probably back at his hotel, maybe already asleep. But the ripple he started that night was still moving. And maybe it always would. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable moments on live TV are the ones that have nothing to do with the show. They're the ones that change you when you least expect it.